Hello, everyone. I'm Ralph, a software engineer here at Genesys, and I would like to share in this DevDrop how to use Amazon API Gateway to invoke Genesys Cloud APIs. And this is part 3, HTTP API. So with HTTP API, we have discussed in the previous video that it's the most basic out of the two that we'll be discussing in this DevDrop. So it's between HTTP API and REST API. So HTTP API is straightforward as it forwards the entire request directly to your backend services. For our case, it's the Genesys Cloud API. It is best used when your use case is simple, where you don't need to modify the information before or after sending any information to the client and the backend services. It also has simple features, which we have discussed in the previous video, that you can set up like route authorization, course configuration, metrics, logging, throttling, and also the import and export of OpenAPI definitions. So being simple as it is cheaper to maintain compared to the REST API. So with that, let's set it up. So here we are at the AWS console management. By the way, I'll be demonstrating this in the AWS console management, which is much more helpful for guides like these. So here we are at the API gateway, and automatically we are at the create API because I don't have any APIs created at this account. So let's choose the HTTP API and we'll click the build. And then for the first step, we'll just create and configure the integrations. We want to add the Genesys Cloud API into this, so we'll just add it. We have an option to also add a Lambda here. So let's just choose the HTTP for our Genesys API. You have to choose the method. If you want to just expose a specific endpoint, you can choose this. Since you can also add multiple integrations later. But for now, let's just add all of the Genesys Cloud APIs. So I'll be choosing the api.mypurecloud.com. And you should change this depending on which region is much more optimized for you or more appropriate to you. And again, as I've said recently, that you can just expose specific routes depending on you. So you may want to just use expose users and only users, or you can just also expose everything after that. So we'll just add a open and close bracket of proxy. And for our use case, let's just expose everything. So I'll be removing the rest and just leave the open and close bracket of proxy here. And then lastly, you just have to name the API. And you can name whatever you want with it. So for our case, let's just use Genesys HTTP API test. So let's go next. We just have to configure the routes. This is the route that you'll be calling when you're calling the API gateway. So for our case, since AWS has automatically added the integration that we've just created, and we also just want to pass through anything that the API gateway receives, uh, let's also add a proxy here. So let's just modify this one. And let's just add a plus here. So anything that the API gateway receives with the path or the route, it will just be passed through to the api.mypeercloud.com with the same route. So we're done with this. If there's anything or any custom configurations, you can add additional routes, and I'll leave it to you. So let's go to the next. We just have to define the stages. So you can have multiple stages. Typically in the software development, you should have like three stages at the minimum. So three of those are the development stage. The second one is the staging, and then the last one is the production. But for this one, we'll just leave it as default, so we won't be needing any stages. But if ever that you'll be deploying this in your use case, I would suggest that you would make three stages at the minimum. But we'll just leave this like this, and any changes that we'll do, we'll just leave the auto deploy. So any changes that we are going to make, it would deploy automatically. So next, so the last one is just that it will check everything that you've created in terms of the integrations, the routes. So I think everything is okay. Then as for the stages, we just leave it as is, and then we'll create it. So there it is. It's already okay. You can see when clicking at the API here, this is the default endpoint already. And then we can use like HTTP clients or REST clients to test our API. I'll just check if, yes. So you can see here in the integrations part that the route for our API is connected already to the api.mypeercloud.com/proxy. And then we can test it with a Postman. So this is like my previous one. Previous test, let's just clear this one. And let's copy the API that we had. Let's just paste this one. And do make sure that you already have your headers provided already. Since everything that the API gateway that we made, everything that's being sent from the API gateway will just be passed through to the API of Genesys. So you also need to provide the access token. So let's just get one. So I have set up Postman to set the authorization from the client token, and it will just give me the token for this, and it will be passed on through the headers. So for our demonstration, let's like get the list of users, v2/users. So again, we're calling the API gateway that we just created to call the Genesys Cloud API. So let's test it. So there, we've got some list, and it returns the same responses that the API of Genesys returns, but it returns it to the API gateway, and then it returns to our Postman client. So the HTTP API also has features here, which we have discussed previously, like authorization. So you can set up for each route, you can set up different authorizations. So you can select IAM or you can create. So like JWT, you can make a Lambda, um, but we won't be discussing on how to do these. Um, so there's also course configuration, the importing of open API definitions. You can actually import the whole open API definitions of Genesis to this one. You can also export this API to an open API through definition. Can also do monitoring. So you can choose the stage, and then you can enable metrics. Logging can also enable it, and also throttling. So yeah, that's how you set up an API gateway with REST API. So in the next part, I'll be showing you how to make an API gateway with REST API, which is a bit much complex, but it's still quite easy to set it up. So see you in the next one.